Real diversity is a good thing, the variety of human consciousness around the world and through history. Bruce Charlton. Because I believe that all beings, each being, including each human being, is unique in terms of its origin as an eternal spirit, the variety of people, and other beings, is not something that needs to be explained or justified. This variety is assumed to be a fact of reality, and, as such, something that God must deal with. So, God doesn't make us different, we just are different, and always have been, from eternity. But that was originally a situation of separate and indifferent difference. What God is working on, through the span of creation, is how to create a reality in which all these different beings work together by love. This is why the family is the best metaphor or model for reality, not just for human reality, but for divine creation as a whole. In a good family, an ideal family, the best we can imagine, we neither expect nor seek for uniformity. The ideal family is one in which each member's differences from each other are harmonized and made good by their mutual love and shared aims. I think this understanding is also applicable to the wide variety of types of men, in the world now and through history. It is not so much that diversity is good, as that it is a fact. Indeed, the concept diversity, as used now, is an abstract summary of certain kind of group difference, and either ignores love or else assumes love to be a thing that can be induced, ordered and legislated as required, as when religious leaders instruct their adherents to love such and such, insofar as they mean anything at all. It is not real love as understood by Christians, by Jesus. From God's point of view, there are a wide range of spirits that may benefit from incarnation, and the wide range of types of society that exist around the world, and across what is known of human history, can be seen as ways of grouping types of human beings to provide what, on average, because that is all any society can provide, conditions conducive to salvation of that kind of soul. I think this is probably the reason for both the variety of individuals at any one time, and the variety of races, places and nations in God's creation, and the directional changes in human consciousness through history. For instance, the development of consciousness from that of hunter-gatherers, through agrarians in larger and larger societies, to the modern consciousness which has emerged preceding and since the Industrial Revolution. God was, I think, trying to provide a wide range of environments for the wide range of human spirits that may benefit from incarnation. Different types of men were therefore, on the whole, born into different historical eras, and different places and races of the world. The process was, of course, primarily individually tailored to the needs of specific individual persons, yet in practice this entailed a variety of societies both vertically, through history, and horizontally, in any given point in history. Of course, working against this ideal are the powers of purposive evil, the demons, and the aspects of evil in every man. These are aimed at wrecking God's best efforts at providing certain broad types of individuals with broadly helpful environments. Nowadays, the main efforts are homogenizing, and are directed at destroying these diverse environments, and trying to impose a world where everybody, and eventually everything, is regarded as the same, and treated as the same. The strategy of evil is that men and women, children and adults, those of different race and nation, the actual environment in which people live, the rules and media under which they live. All of these are to be pressed into the direction of actual global homogeneity, by vast programs of indoctrination, population movement and coercion. This homogenizing, totalitarian, program is breaking down rather rapidly, but still in operation, and still used to justify the emerging actuality of deliberately chaotic destructive evil, which is superseding it. Evil is effective only insofar as it contains some partial good. Good intentions are so dangerous, which is why evil is always untruthful, and disguises its destructive, anti-divine creation, aims by apparent good. so that the global program of reducing the world to a single and uniform environment for all people and peoples, is dishonestly, albeit superficially, disguised as its opposite. As sorting individuality. As supporting freedom. This kind of inversion of values, supported by subversion then inversion of terms and concepts, is nowadays a pervasive reality of everyday life, especially in the West from which the strategy of evil is administered. But I think we need to beware of reacting against that which is truly good, and in accordance with God's intentions, simply because the terminology and concepts have been captured and reversed. For instance, the reality of love, the core truth of Christianity, does not itself become evil, when the word has been captured and almost reversed to mean in practice lust, self-gratification, or suicidal altruism. Likewise, diversity in the sense of the uniqueness of every human being, is a reality and part of God's creative endeavor. Thus it is a serious error to respond to the evil-motivated modern diversity by advocating its opposite, by insisting upon the suppression of individual uniqueness by coercion, that is falling into a trap set by the enemy, it is aiding the enemy. My understanding is that in heaven there is great diversity, more than on earth, because every soul is unique, and always has been, and this is positively valued. I think heaven works as an ideal family, or rather, many ideal families, lovingly related into something like clans, tribes and a nation, each bound to each by eternal commitment to mutual love, but with that love stronger because more individual, and personalized in the smaller dyads and groupings. In such a situation, the more differences between individuals, and the more these are developed, in the spirit of love, and so long as the difference is derived from real nature, the better, because the greater will be the potential scope of the whole. Every single new soul who enters heaven then adds to the scope and possibilities. The many mansions of heaven mentioned in the Bible may be taken to refer to the probable situation of heaven being a perfection of what we can glimpse on earth, large differences in consciousness and environment, analogous to the differences through history, of races and nations, and between families. Note, an example is the apparently very strong desire to arrange people by categories of personality and type, then for these categories to bleed across into the spiritual realm. I was, professionally, an intelligence and personality psychologist, and so I am aware of the pragmatic value of categories. It is, indeed, trivially easy to invent categories that have statistical predictive value. For instance, young children can be divided into two categories by their response to a wide range of one-off and brief psychological tests, and these categories will, even decades later, have measurably different behavioral outcomes. Yet, I am also aware of the pitfalls and limitations of these tests at the level of individuals. And the exceptions may be important, as seen by the biologically maladaptive, and/or socially negative, personalities of most geniuses. Yet such categorization was mainly a feature of an historical era of human consciousness, the medieval mind, with its humors linked to elements, its astrology, its castes and guilds, all of which had some level of validity, yet which have become less and less relevant as human consciousness has developed towards individual agency and self-awareness. More importantly, I am sure that what God wants from us, starting from here, and from now, is very different. We need to grasp firmly and with clarity that in an ultimate way, aside from the pragmatic social management, mostly related to efficiency, surveillance and control, which knowledge is now primarily used for evil ends, anyway, we are dealing with very diverse individual beings, and these ought to be known essentially in terms of Christian values. It is not our Christian duty to assist with the effective administration of a society dedicated, top DWN and pervasively throughout, towards evil ends. Divisiveness and unity. William Wildblood. Nowadays you regularly hear condemnation of this or that person or attitude for divisiveness as though to separate was intrinsically bad and to join in unity always good. You must respect those whose views are different to yours, or society cannot get along, or so it goes. But here's the truth. Divisiveness is good. It is even essential if you wish to preserve truth. I don't respect falsehood, I don't respect wickedness, I don't respect anything or anybody that denies the reality of God. To condemn divisiveness is a trick of the devil to get us to accept his degenerate and corrupt agenda. We must separate good from evil, truth from lies, love from hate. But principally we must separate that which acknowledges God from that which does not. Then other things will follow. You don't love the devil and his works. You don't include them in a fatuous oneness. You reject them utterly, as well as the souls that embrace them, though with compassion for such souls, for while you reject their error and the inner spiritual sinfulness that has led them into error, you still know them as potential sons and daughters of God if they can repent of the sins that have caused them to go astray. Christ brought a sword, the sword that cleaves truth from lies. In that sense, he was the most divisive person who has ever lived, but, at the same time, he also came to heal the division caused by the satanic introduction of the lie. The devil seeks unity so that he may separate souls from God. Christ divides truth from the lie in order to unite souls with God on a higher plane. I have posted this under the two tags of equality and non-duality, for the former is a secular version of the latter. Both equality and non-duality see all souls as one and basically the same, but they miss the truth that true oneness can only be attained after division has done its work in separating out that which accepts God from that which rejects him. And note that the rejection of God is not just the deliberate refusal of him, but also the lack of positive acceptance. There is the active denial of God, and there is the more passive ignoring of him, and though the latter may be less spiritually destructive, it is still rejection. The lesson for souls in this world is not for them to realize the unity of everything in it regardless of what it is, but to learn to separate good from evil and true from false. Through this separation one grows into true spiritual unity in the reality of God. Lesser evil is never good. Francis Berger. Let's focus on this. A conscious, uncoerced choice for lesser evil reveals an awareness that one is indeed choosing evil, hence, the matter boils down to qualifying evil to avoid the choice perceived as greater evil. In the end, one has still chosen evil rather than good. I don't believe God places anyone in circumstances that prevent alignment with good over evil. Individual failure to recognize or discover a good choice does not absolve one of choosing lesser evil. The responsibility for the choice remains. Part of that responsibility entails acknowledging the choice for lesser evil as an authentic choice for evil and repenting it. Rationalizing a choice for lesser evil as good only exacerbates the evil inherent in the choice, to the point that it perhaps even exceeds the greater evil choice one shunned. Values consumerism is evil. Bruce Charlton. The point at which I recognized the beginning of the end for genuine and nature-rooted environmentalism was when green consumerism emerged in the later 1980s, a concept that now dominates the green movement almost to the point of monopoly. The idea was that green values would be promoted by properly directed expenditure of green consumers, by their buying choices. This replaced the earlier idea that those who aimed to preserve the natural world should reduce their consumption. Half a century ago, an archetypal environmentalist tried to be self-sufficient by living as a modern peasant on 3 acres and a cow. Nowadays he works as a sustainability bureaucrat, and inhabits a solar-paneled mansion with a hybrid and an electric car for each member of the family. Since the late 80s there has been a vast proliferation of consumer guides, further shaped by totalitarian regulations, that advise and direct people on how to spend their money, such as to support sustainability, diversity, feminism, or whatever totalitarian leftist agenda item most takes your fancy. And these are mirrored, in a much smaller way among those who purport to oppose leftism, on the right, and even among those who purport to support Christian values. The current world, including the blogosphere, is therefore replete with advice and instructions about which companies and products we ought to choose, and which we ought to avoid. This is very popular because, apparently, nearly everybody seems to enjoy moralistically advising other people what they should and shouldn't do with respect to their own particular hobby horse. Especially while pretending that this is all morally highly significant, and that the advisor's own lifestyle preferences are objective evidence of moral superiority. So public discourse is full of stuff about the need either to buy, or to boycott, this, or that. In the UK, we have seen the ultimate reductio ad absurdum of training young children in schools to regard the issue of plastic drinking straw usage as a major issue of values, and to celebrate the banning of such instruments of the devil as a triumph of environmental protection. This consumerist moral perspective is grossly inadequate as a life goal, because it necessarily supports the existing system in a deep and qualitative way, while pretending to influence it by living in accordance with superficial, quantitative differences, supposed distinctions that are often too small, too temporary, and too uncertain to have even the potential to make a significant positive difference. Indeed, this perspective is worse than inadequate, worse than useless. It is a profoundly harmful way of living, because it is strategically stupid and deliberately dishonest. And not by accident. The fact that values consumerism emerged when it did, and that it is supported by the globalist totalitarians, Western and international politics, big media, big finance, big corporations etc., demonstrates that it is values consumerism which is literally and without exaggeration a tool of Satan, an instrument of the devil. Personality psychology has declined badly since the death of Hans J Eysenck. Bruce Charlton. Many areas of science have declined substantially over the past several decades, and one of these is the field of personality psychology, where we have now given up on the rigorous and multidisciplinary approach best exemplified by Hans J Eysenck, and are back to the pre-theoretical, indeed medieval, world of that sounds like a good idea. The thing about inventing categories of personality is that it is trivially easy, because they all have some predictive validity, therefore there is no end to the proliferation of typologies and categorizations. For instance, young children can be classified into two groups by a 10-minute test of whether they are able to defer a present reward, for example 1 biscuit, in order to get a greater reward a few minutes later, for example 2 biscuits, and these groups have statistically different outcomes later in life. People can be categorized into groups according to the 4 humors, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, and blood, of by Jung's categorization developed as Myers-Briggs, or by the Big Five or any number of others, all with some predictive validity with respect to future behavior. A small research project I did easily showed that those with a tattoo had a significantly self-reported higher rate of drug and alcohol use than those without. Another little project showed that those who possessed digital bathrooms scales had a higher rate of reported eating disorders. The point is there are innumerable traits that are predictive. Almost any characteristic you can think of has some value of this kind, and when characteristics have multiple components, i.e. when one creates a syndrome of characteristics, the correlations will be greater. For example, the typologies used in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM of the American Psychiatric Association, used in psychiatry, or for that matter the typical star signs used in astrology, they will usually demonstrate statistical differences in outcome. For example, Eysenck reported astrological differences many decades ago. The predictive validity of different schemes can be studied comparatively to seek higher statistical correlations, but this process is very sensitive to sample and population selection, and still lacks discriminative power. But only Eysenck, and those influenced by him, properly recognized that, in order to make progress, the scientific implication was that personality psychology must go beyond lists of characteristics to include as many as possible cross-correlations drawn from other biological sciences, such as cross-species comparisons, biochemical distinctions, for example in brain, or of blood, response to drugs, psychiatric correlates, medical correlates, evolutionary theory, and so forth. Eysenck made some progress in testing his categories: extroversion, introversion, neuroticism, and to some extent psychoticism, by such means, and more importantly he provided a program by which this ought to be done. But Eysenck's program was abandoned, and the predictable outcome has been a proliferation of personality typologies, each of which has its group of believers, but none of which go beyond the trivial and common-sense knowledge that how people behaved in the past may have an influence on how they behave in the future. Note: I invite readers to apply the above critique to currently common self and other categorizations, including their own favorites, relating to sexual typology and preference, lifestyle, consumer choices, race, ethnicity, residence, political and religious affiliation, etc., etc. Mary Magdalene and the role of women in Christianity, mundane and cosmic. Bruce Charlton. The role of women in religion can be examined from the point of view of the extent to which it is mundane, i.e. to do with the conduct of mortal life in this world, or cosmic, i.e. concerned with eternal matters and existence out with this mortal life. A cosmic role for women could be a religion where the creator was a woman, or when one or more of the gods was a woman, and there are also other possibilities. My main interest is in Christianity. In historical Christianity we can see a cosmic role for the Mother of Jesus in both the Eastern and Western Catholic churches. And Mormons regard God the Creator as a dyad of man and woman, heavenly parents who manifested divine creation and, in some literal sense, procreated men. Other types of Christianity among Protestants have essentially zero cosmic role for women, and this applies to Judaism and Islam. As regards a mundane role for women, this is seen in terms of supernatural help with everyday life. This could range from a theologically formal role of female saints and other holy women in helping with various problems of life, to all kinds of unofficial, popular and folk beliefs of the same kind, that shade off into superstitions and luck, and may occur even in what are officially strictly monotheistic religions. At a further remove, there is the matter of women's role in the various churches. In some religions women have an essential role in churches, but in historical Christianity this has not been the case. Sometimes all essential church roles were restricted to men, but in all instances women were inessential to the work of the church. The religion can be conducted entirely without participation of women. Another vital aspect relates to Jesus Christ. When it comes to a cosmic role for women in the life and work of Jesus Christ, historical Christianity has either had none, or has focused exclusively on the Mother of Jesus, whose role is probably only of explicitly cosmic significance relatively late in the history of the Roman Catholic Church, with the doctrine of Immaculate Conception. Even the mundane role of women in the usual versions of the life of the adult Jesus during his ministry is minor to the point of being inessential. This is, variously, a consequence of taking either the whole Bible, or the whole New Testament, or Synoptic Gospels, or Pauline epistles, as the major basis for Christian assumptions, and also of deriving core assumptions of church authority, tradition, and a lineage of theology and practice dating back to church fathers. However, my understanding of Christianity is focused upon the fourth Gospel, regarded as the earliest and most authoritative source of knowledge. As such, I see a potentially cosmic role for Mary Magdalene, who I believe to have been the wife of Jesus, and brother of Lazarus, whom I regard as the author of the fourth Gospel. Here, in brief, is what I regard as the description of Mary Magdalene's cosmic role in the work of Jesus Christ, using the fourth Gospel. See this link for further discussion and more detailed referencing. The marriage at Cana, chapter 2, is a rather garbled and tampered with account of Jesus' marriage to Mary Magdalene, and it was the time of his first miracle. I assume that Jesus became aware of his divinity at the time of his baptism by John, but he did not perform a miracle until he was married to Mary, which marriage therefore implicitly has a cosmic dimension, far beyond any mundane earthly ceremony. Jesus encounters Mary on the way to resurrection of Lazarus, chapter 11, his profoundest and greatest miracle, the first resurrection. Then again the mysterious episode of the anointing of Jesus' feet by Mary, chapter 12, when he realized and announced that his death was imminent. Mary Magdalene was present, with Jesus' mother, other women, and Lazarus, at Jesus' death on the cross, chapter 19, and was then the first to meet him 2 days later when resurrected, chapter 20. I take these descriptions, bracketing Jesus' death and resurrection, to imply that Mary had some cosmic role in these unprecedented, and eternally significant events. The last we hear of Mary and Jesus is when he tells her, "I ascend unto my Father, and your Father, and to my God, and your God," which I regard as an anticipation of the continuation of their eternal, cosmic marriage in heaven, after Jesus' ascension and Mary's resurrection. Was the British Celtic Church actually paganism with a veneer of Christianity, or the opposite? Bruce Charlton.
Edited from New Light on the Ancient Mystery of Glastonbury, by John Michel, 1990. Celtic Christianity has been called a mere reformation of Druidry. A unique and remarkable feature of the early church in Britain and Ireland is that it claimed no martyrs through persecution by the religion it supplanted. The Druids had no difficulty in accepting the new religion, because it scarcely interfered with the existing religious and social order. The system of the early church was really paganism with a veneer of Christianity.
I have often seen this written, however, I think it more likely that the opposite was true. And the reason for such opposite interpretations is due to very different concepts of what Christianity actually is. If Christianity is essentially the church, and Christendom, a church-dominated and permeated society, then clearly the newly converted pagans must have only a superficial smattering, a veneer, of the new faith over and substructure that can only be pagan. The newly converted Celtic British Christians did not have a trained and ordained hierarchy of priests, these must have been few, and far between. The Britons did not have a comprehensive coverage by churches offering the sacraments. Nor had they experienced Christian teaching, nor did they live under a system of societal laws in conformity with the church's understanding. Instead, there inevitably must have been, for many years, mostly the residue of whatever actually was the system of Druidic religion, its sacred places, its Druids, its practices, and the effects of generations of its teaching. Furthermore, Christians seem to have had a deliberate policy of taking over and repurposing pagan shrines or gathering places. This strategy extended to making pagan gods into Christian saints, the best evidenced of which is the Irish god Bridget becoming the famous and beloved saint of the same name. Surely, so this argument goes, all this means that for many years the British were still essentially pagan. Surely, their Christianity was, at first, merely a veneer of Christianized language and symbolism, such as a cross inscribed or erected upon a megalithic standing stone, on top of what long remained a pagan religion. But if Christianity is accepting Jesus as Savior, desiring resurrection to eternal heavenly life, and embracing the intent of living by love, then none of the substructure of paganism really matters. By this argument, what makes someone a Christian is the choice to follow Jesus Christ, with what that entails in a cosmic, eternal, post-mortal sense, and the rest of religion is, at best, an optional extra. Of course, there would have been many aspects of Druidic paganism that conflicted with and contradicted the basic of Christianity in love. But that applied to the Christian Church as well. Much of its actuality contradicts the essence of Christianity, and always has. so long as the newly converted Christian sought resurrection into heaven by following Jesus Christ, instead of seeking whatever it was that Druidic paganism had previously promised, generally regarded as having been some kind of reincarnation, perhaps involving metempsychosis, then I would argue that the new Celtic convert was fully Christian. I think there are lessons for Christians here and now. Any Christian needs to navigate a world including whatever church he belongs to, and whichever religion or ideology rules his society, that is substantially hostile to his deepest convictions. Yet none of this prevents him from being fully a Christian, if that is what he most desires to be. As Jesus himself said, Christianity is for sinners, not perfect men, and for this actual sinful world, not some ideal society. Society cannot prevent anyone from becoming and being Christian. Because ultimately Christianity is not of this world, and because resurrection and heaven comes from Jesus, not from this world. What we absolutely need to do, and must do, is to want it. Note, certainly, the Celtic Christian era in the British Isles led, over the following centuries, to a greater number and, even more so, concentration of saints, and great saints, still remembered as patron saints, in church and city foundations, and festivals, like Cuthbert, Patrick, David, Kentigern/Mungo, and Bridget, than at any other time in the history of these parts. Hierarchy and Complementarity. William Wildblood. Complementarity is not equality. I have seen writings by self-styled traditionalists, and even some esotericists who should know better but who are clearly still influenced by Enlightenment ideas, which ostensibly decry feminism but say that men and women are different but equal because they complement each other, with each being superior in its own domain. This is true up to a point, but it falls short of the cosmic meaning behind sex differences, and the laws of the macrocosm should be reflected in the microcosm for order to prevail on that level. Men and women are certainly complementary to each other. That is obvious to all but the most hidebound of feminists, but it does not mean they are equal other than in spiritual worth on the individual level. However, that is a separate issue. The truth is that there is a hierarchical as well as a complementary aspect to the male/female duality, which is symbolized in the story that Eve came out of Adam's side, not vice versa, and also revealed by the fact that to God all souls are feminine in respect of their relationship to Him. He represents, or, better put, is the positive pole. The nature of masculinity and femininity finds its first origins in this relationship. A Christian might see it reflected in the idea that the Church is the bride of Christ. This is a relationship of love but not equality. To say that men and women are complementary and equal but different, with women better at being women and men better at being men, is only a half-truth. The masculine pole is prior in the hierarchy of creation, and in that sense men do have spiritual authority over women, an authority they must exercise if order and harmony are to reign. The feminine is an essential part of creation which is necessarily dualistic as in subject and object, but it is subordinate to the masculine as matter is to spirit. Without matter, spirit cannot be expressed, but spirit is the primordial reality. This foundation truth lies at the heart of the masculine/feminine polarity, and in a smooth-running universe it should function with love and creativity. But in the human world, female ego and male misuse of power has created a war between the sexes, and a lack of love on both sides. This hierarchical relationship does not mean that women should just be submissive wives and mothers as in some traditionalist Christian schools of thought. Still less does it support the Islamic fear and suppression of women, which has only produced a stunted and largely uncreative culture. The post-Renaissance change in consciousness, entailing a greater focus on the self, that started in the West and then spread everywhere, affected everyone, men and women. But the female expression of that should be within the context of womanhood, not pseudo-masculinity, and it must still observe the priority of the masculine pole. There will be individual cases where that is not so, but these are the exceptions that prove the rule. In general, the principle of masculine or solar rulership must hold if culture and civilization are to function according to spiritual principles. When it does not, as in the modern quasi-matriarchy, everything will fall apart, as indeed is happening in our day, whether admitted or not. God has given us the sun and the moon to demonstrate the truth of this relationship. The sun rules the day and the moon the night, and, in that sense, they are complementary, one to the other. But the moon draws its light from the sun, though it processes this light according to its own unique nature. Esoterically, there are lunar mysteries where the feminine rules and solar mysteries where it is the masculine force that dominates. But the solar mysteries relate to higher initiations and deeper truths, spirit rather than soul. Early man worshipped the Great Mother or Goddess because he only knew the natural and psychic worlds and could not yet relate to higher spiritual forces. Spiritual evolution in those days consisted of breaking free of the bond of the mother, which was essential if man was to become a free agent. Many stories in early mythology relate to this battle. Now we live in an era in which the feminine is reasserting itself after a period of suppression, but it is doing so in an unbalanced and ignorant way. The feminine must be expressed, but it must be so in the context of wisdom, not desire for power, and that means it must recognize the overall rulership of the masculine. Men and women complement each other, of course, but there is no such thing as equality anywhere in the universe. It is a doctrine spread by the fallen powers in order to put their agenda on an equal footing with that of God. Added note: the ultimate goal of evolution is the complete infusion of matter by spirit with its subsequent transformation and glorification. This is the mystic marriage of cosmic masculine and cosmic feminine and foreshadows the union of God with his creation. Thus, we can see that the feminine, which is matter, nature, all creation, and the masculine, which is spirit, are two halves of one whole, in a horizontal sense equal because both need each other, but in the vertical sense spirit has hierarchical preeminence. Focusing on the work, not the corrections. Francis Berger. If I had to define the Christianity I have pursued over the past decade or so, yes, pursue, not practice or follow, I would say that I do my utmost to focus on Jesus' work rather than the corrections to his work. By focusing on the work, I am referring to discerning the true nature of Jesus' teaching, how we can align with it, and what we can do and think to be in harmony with it. As for the corrections, I count virtually everything and anything that dilutes, weakens, adulterates, laces, misinterprets, denatures, taints, or corrupts the work and its essence. Detecting the corrections and distinguishing it from the work is not always easy, but it is always worth the effort. C.S. Lewis on Immortality, a misleading example and bad advice. Bruce Charlton. Like many people in the past decades, I owe a significant debt to C.S. Lewis as an agent of my conversion to Christianity. Lewis is more than a beloved and much pondered writer for me, he is more like a friend. Nonetheless, beyond the basic fact of that conversion, which is, after all, the main thing, I also absorbed from C.S. several elements of what I now regard as serious error, especially in terms of the ultimate question of what Christianity is. Even before I became a Christian, and for a good while afterwards, many months, and indeed residually for some years, I would have subscribed to this statement by C.S. Lewis in Surprised by Joy. The bolded sections I have added for emphasis.
My conversion involved as yet no belief in a future life. I now number it among my greatest mercies that I was permitted for several months, perhaps for a year, to know God and to attempt obedience without even raising the question, i.e. the question of whether, and how, there was a connection between God and joy. My training was like that of the Jews, to whom he revealed himself centuries before there was a whisper of anything better, or worse, beyond the grave than shadowy and featureless Sheol. And I did not dream even of that. There are men, far better men than I, who have made immortality almost the central doctrine of their religion, but for my own part I have never seen how a preoccupation with that subject at the outset could fail to corrupt the whole thing. I had been brought up to believe that goodness was goodness only if it were disinterested, and that any hope of reward or fear of punishment contaminated the will. If I was wrong in this, the question is really much more complicated than I then perceived. My error was most tenderly allowed for. I was afraid that threats or promises would demoralize me. No threats or promises were made. The commands were inexorable, but they were backed by no sanctions. God was to be obeyed simply because he was God. Long since, through the gods of Asgard, and later through the notion of the absolute, he had taught me how a thing can be revered not for what it can do to us but for what it is in itself. That is why, though it was a terror, it was no surprise to learn that God is to be obeyed because of what he is in himself. If you ask why we should obey God, in the last resort the answer is, I am. To know God is to know that our obedience is due to him. In his nature his sovereignty de jure is revealed.
Lewis explains that it was a good thing for him, implicitly in a psychological sense. 1. That he was unconcerned by the question of immortality, of life beyond mortal life. 2. That he regarded his faith essentially as obedience, and obedience to a God to whom obedience was due impersonally, because he was God, which I take to mean, the creator of everything from nothing, omnipotent, omniscient etc., and without consideration of any personal values. And it seems clear, and Lewis himself confirms, that this attitude to God is closely analogous to that of Judaism, and, he might have added, to Islam. Lewis even goes so far as to say that it is corrupting to religion for personal immortality to be the central doctrine. Unfortunately, as it now seemed to me, I imbibed this personal prejudice of Lewis's along with my conversion. Consequently, I found that reading the fourth gospel was extremely confusing, since it seemed obvious that immortality, of a particular kind, resurrected, was the focus of Jesus' teaching. There are also accounts, which impress me, that suggest immortality was a primary means of conversion. I am forced to conclude that Lewis's personal history and psychology led him into a very serious misunderstanding of Christianity, but I would add that it is not at all uncommon and I had exactly the same misconception. And for much the same reason, in that I became a Christian via monotheism. That is, through intermediate stages of recognizing that we inhabited a creation, and recognizing the reality of transcendental values, truth, beauty, virtue, cohesion. In other words, again much like Lewis, I regarded the history of Christianity as essentially cumulative, and the nature of Christianity as added on to pre-existent Greek philosophy and Hebrew theology. I now regard this as deeply wrong, in its essentially reality. Of course Jesus lived at a point in time, in which there were pre-existent cultural and religious realities. But I now see Jesus as offering something fundamentally simple, eternal, heavenly, resurrected life, and qualitatively new, a second creation. I see the intellectual structures of pre-existent Hebrew monotheism and Greek philosophy as not just irrelevant, but distorting to the real nature of the religion of Jesus Christ. In particular, it seems like bad advice to suggest that people ought not to be concerned with the question of immortality, and that we ought not to try and understand the relationship between their own values and the nature of God. Such ideas point away from, not towards, Christianity as it ought to be understood, the teaching of Jesus Christ revealed in the fourth gospel, and, much more importantly, an understanding which is simple and clear enough to be knowable by direct personal revelation. Ultimate outsiders, willingly so. Bruce Charlton. In the 60 years since Colin Wilson published The Outsider, describing the state of sociological, psychological and spiritual alienation characteristic of the past couple of centuries, the situation has changed. In 1956 it was possible to regard the outsider as being rescued from his predicament by external change, but now he can only rescue himself. The current outsider has only one place to look for help, within himself. Thus, in politics and sociology there are no utopias, and all large institutions are thoroughly corrupted, including the main churches. The intellectual elites are dishonest and incompetent. Science in 1956 was overwhelmingly successful, but has become a careerist bureaucracy. The universities seemed like a haven of privilege and leisure, but they are now the habitus of petty officials, dishonest spinners and box tickers. We have no leaders, only middle managers and psychopaths, therefore, we must rely on ourselves. There is nobody else to turn to. We must find what we need in ourselves, because it will not be supplied by any person or institution. We, here and now, are the ultimate outsiders because we have nowhere to turn. Indeed, there are very few other people even to talk with about such matters. We are fortunate indeed if we have a marriage and family to sustain us, because these two have been destroyed over the past 60 years. We cannot trust anybody, we must trust ourselves. We are forced either to seek oblivion in distraction and intoxication or suicide, to escape alienation by escaping consciousness, or else to look within. But looking within is the answer. It always was, if only the outsider allows himself to acknowledge the reality of God. When we look within, and begin to dismantle the false selves and automatic thinking, we find God. The old outsiders such as Nietzsche regarded the God within, the self, as an alternative to God, but we know that the God within is God. Since we are God's children, we ourselves are divine. Christians know this, or should, which means we have inherited divinity. God is within us as well as without. The external God is denied us, but God within is undeniable. We can, should and will find Christianity within us. We can find Christianity despite being denied true and valid scriptures, tradition, legitimate religious teaching, rituals. We can find Christianity within us with total confidence because we know our loving God who created and sustains reality would not leave us unprovided for. If within is the only place left to us, then within will suffice. We will find there everything we need. We will find faith, courage and motivation. We will find love. We are in a situation where, if we honestly seek to answer the condition of alienation, nihilism and despair, there is no alternative to doing what we should anyway be doing, looking within, to find not only our true selves, but God and all the necessities that only God can provide. We have the possibility of a degree of spiritual agency, freedom and autonomy seldom seen in the history of the world. And everything is channeling us towards exactly that. We are fated to be the ultimate outsiders, like it or not. But we can solve the problem of alienation by willingly becoming the ultimate outsiders. By embracing, rather than avoiding, reality, we can become free, true and live from our divinity, albeit partially, with frequent errors and sins, but that is enough. We cannot be made to make the right choice. We might instead continue to choose oblivion and the destruction of consciousness. Drugs, social media, transgressive sex, even the destruction of our own persons by transhumanist technologies. However, that choice is becoming clearer and clearer, more and more conscious, to the point of being unavoidable. Yes, indeed, things have come to a point. Note, the crux of my point is that God, as Christians understand God, creator, loving, and a personal God, concerned by every individual, would not leave anybody, at any time or in any place, bereft of spiritual necessities. The world, as we actually experience it, from our own point of view, is adequate. Indeed, since life is not a random accident, in some vital sense you and I personally, and everybody else, have been placed into mortal life in a time and at a place at least adequately suited to our individual needs for experiencing and learning. Edited from a post of July 18, 2017. Hat tip Laeth for the reminder. What have you got against AI? Bruce Charlton. AI, artificial intelligence, has done a lot of harm by making it seem necessary for us to defend not interacting personally with AI entities and AI products. We need to notice and think about this. It reveals that an open-ended acceptance of AI into human society is already the default. We got here step by step over many decades and centuries, and indeed all online communities, such as you, reading this, are already many steps along the way, but general, consensus, default AI acceptance brings us all the way. We have arrived. What this means is that there is here and now a consensus, which may itself be mostly artificial, that it already is, and indeed should be, fine and normal for individual human beings to interact, inevitably personally, indiscriminately with some unknown and unknowable mixture of other humans and AI entities and products. The key concept is interact. From my perspective, this implicitly amounts to a denial of the ultimate reality and existential significance of this mortal life. Which is, of course, a great victory for the powers of purposive evil. And such a situation is not some future possible dystopian bogeyman state that may happen if we are not careful. For many, many people this is how things already are. For some of these people, and I suspect this has always been the case, I think there never has been any genuine inner distinction between interacting with other real beings, and with simulated beings, with projections, for instance, because such people are ultimately solipsistic, they only really believe in themselves. But there seem to be more and more such people, because they are numerous and strong enough to demand that anyone who does not want to become one of them, must justify why not. When you are in a situation of trying to convince others why not go along with their plans for you, you have already and decisively lost the rhetorical war, the battle of public relations. At which point you either give up and join the downslide to damnation, or else effectively fight back, maybe materially, certainly spiritually. Think ahead, look back. The spiritual perspective and the problem of pain. Bruce Charlton. There is a spiritual problem with pain, especially if pain is understood to refer to the whole gamut of aversive emotions, and all kinds of sufferings. And this problem is that it is not then possible to think about complex matters, or follow a chain of reasoning. Instead, the pain tends to monopolize attention and overwhelm efforts at other purposive activities, including spiritual. This may mean that our usual, and ideal, spiritual practices cannot, or at any rate do not, happen, and we may become habitually focused upon the material, on palliating or escaping the pain. What is needed, in a spiritual sense, must be extremely simple, because otherwise it won't happen. A mantra is one traditional tactic, an over and over repeated word or short phrase. For Christians, this has often been the Jesus prayer, or, even shorter, the name of Jesus. But these were devised during the medieval era when man's consciousness was such that, to a significant extent, the word was that which was represented, the word was the thing. Then, to speak the name of Jesus was itself to become aligned with Jesus. For modern men this may not happen. Instead of the name of Jesus having a positive spiritual effect, it may be that the name of Jesus just loses all meaning and spiritual connotations when too often repeated. It just become automatic, a habit, like humming an earworm tune. Here is another possibility, that sometimes works. The aim is to get out from the materiality of here and now, and to restore a spiritual perspective on the current situation. The tactic is: think ahead, look back. This simply means to think ahead in order to imagine being in resurrected eternal life in heaven, then to look back from imagined salvation onto your present situation. If it works, this will, for at least a moment, put your current pain into an eternal and heavenly perspective. it dare not make the pain go away, or even diminish it, but it is a reminder that it cannot go on forever, and will come to an end, a good end, that is a beginning. Since earth is a school and the eternal role of mortal life is as a time and place of learning, looking back is a proper attitude to enable this learning, during times that would otherwise be wholly negative. Think ahead, look back is more difficult and complex than the Jesus prayer, but if the prayer isn't working, it might be worth a try. On reading Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy by John le Carre. Bruce Charlton. I have just listened to a two-part audio recording of John le Carre's famous novel of 1974, Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, superbly read by Michael Jaston, who played Gwilym in the BBC TV adaptation. As a novel, it has many excellent aspects, although the ending is disappointingly anticlimactic. The TV adaptation did this better. But then, there could hardly be any other kind of ending, given John le Carre's worldview. Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy confirmed my earlier impressions of the profound human limitations, or, more exactly, deficiencies of le Carre himself, and the world he depicted. Not one of the Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy characters is likable or capable of love, and this applies even to George Smiley, where le Carre seems to have gone all out to portray goodness in a man. A great deal of weight is put upon Smiley's long-term love for his promiscuous and cruel wife Anne, but Anne is portrayed as incredibly beautiful, popular, aristocratic and well-connected, so the impression is that George is obsessed with and dependent on her, rather than anything recognizable as genuine love. All the other characters' relationships are based on exploitation, manipulation, illusion, social cachet, and a kind of mindless status seeking, or some kind of helpless, addictive and obsessive compulsion. Le Carre could not portray goodness for the simple and obvious reason that he was not himself good. He could only simulate goodness, but not convincingly. Despite all these defects, and the claustrophobic, almost suffocating atmosphere, Tinker, Tailor is a very clever and well-structured whodunit that gives the impression of an honest and accurate insight into the nature of life among the alien denizens of the Norman ruling class, what motivates and gratifies them, what makes them tick. More bits of Laeth, a demonic theme. Bruce Charlton. Another selection from Laeth's aphorism garden.
If you can make deals with the devil while you're here, you certainly can make them before you come here. A lot can be explained with this insight. The illusion of humanity will be destroyed because the devil always overplays his hand. The first Satan wanted to save everyone. The second wanted to damn everyone. The third wants to destroy the very idea of salvation. Satan has armies, God has heroes.
Note, these comments on the devil/Satan have particular resonance for me. I had never considered that premortal souls might incarnate having, covertly, made a deal with the devil, but it would explain a lot. And why not? After all, even such a deal does not rule out the possibility of salvation, so it need not be something that God would prohibit, even if God knew or inferred it had happened. The comment on Satan's attitudes to salvation is a compression and elucidation of what I understand about the progression of Luciferic/Harmonic/Sorithic evil, and clarifies that, when it comes to leadership of that party who oppose God and divine creation, there has probably been more than one. Analysis by cause and effect acting on categories of things is not ultimately true, because relationships between beings are primary. Bruce Charlton. The analysis by causes and effects, using abstract categories of entities, developed in the classical and medieval periods when there was still a great deal of spontaneous, unconscious participation of human consciousness. In other words, when these abstractions cause/effect/category were devised, even things were regarded, quite naturally, and by experience, as personifications, with the kind of innate nature and desires of a living being. But for the modern, especially adult, consciousness participation has dwindled almost to nothing, and even living beings, even human beings, are regarded as if non-living things. Therefore, to seek understanding of people, the abstractions of category, cause and effects are deployed as if these are the primary and bottom line realities, more real and important than the relationships between people. Indeed, relationships between people are themselves subordinated to categorical, cause and effect analysis. The mainstream Christian churches have largely apostatized into modern consciousness, but even the most traditionalist of church Christians have continued to use the classical and medieval versions of abstract analyses, but nowadays, because modern consciousness is so different, these abstractions are not participated, they are alienated and alienating. This is why, for instance, scholastic or Calvinist theologies are so cold and material mechanical to the modern mind, because we cannot help but take them literally, while when they originated the rigorous philosophy was experienced, quite spontaneously, in what we might regard as a poetic, mystical, animistic way. And would-be spiritual explanations for group prayer, ritual, sacredness are often explained, or, at least, asserted, in a kind of pseudo-scientific fashion, as if constituting a laboratory procedure, or a computer program. If you do this, then this in such a fashion, then these will be the objective outcomes. But if, as I believe, the ultimate, metaphysical, reality, is that of beings in relationships, then we ought to be trying to understand in these personal and interpersonal terms. After all, within a good and loving family, the members are not understood in terms of categories, and their relationships are not conducted as if cause and effect recipes for producing desired results. Instead, we realize that we cannot, and should not, treat each other in this mechanistic way, and that our influences on each other are not of a cause and effect nature. To read many trad Christians, one would think that getting married, raising a family and living in a family ought to be a matter of slotting members into the proper categories, then following the correct, and God-approved, procedures for implementing the desired changes and outcomes. But this is to reduce the family to a bureaucracy, and bureaucracy is intrinsically evil. And it matters not whether the particular bureaucracy is secular or church-derived, or if purports to be conducted according to laws and regulations from some interpretation of the Bible, church authority, tradition, theology, or whatnot. The dehumanization, the reduction of beings to things, is just the same. We have all been ingrained with bad habits, actively evil habits, of depersonalization, of mechanizing humans and other beings, and regarding such mechanizing as not just valid but superior, as, supposedly, validated by our understanding of ancient law and practice. Yet such behavior leads us away from salvation, and by a very direct route, by making salvation impersonal, actually non-personal, reduced to a business of the abstract operations of cause and effect on things. Fortunately, it is quick and easy to repent such habits, once we have noticed them, and understood their nature and tendency. We all have built into us, innately, from childhood, the instinct and tendency to understand other people and the world by means of relationships between living, purposive, conscious beings. All we require is to know, to be clear about, to decide, is that this is indeed the right and good way of understanding and acting. Our inevitably many lapses can then be repented, which is, mercifully, all that is absolutely required of us. The example of prayer. And an instance of the above, we may consider the influence of prayer on other people, as explained by Christians. In the medieval past, the individual conscious was less differentiated from, more immersed in, group consciousness. Therefore a prayer did not come entirely from any individual, and did not express the personal wants of any individual, but all valid prayer was significantly from the group consciousness, it actually arose from the group. Its effect was because of this, from the group, to the group. The medievals may have interpreted prayer in a cause and effect way if asked to explain it. For example, I pray for this to happen to him and it happens. But in reality, when prayer was effectual, it was because prayer operated in an unconscious and implicit group context. The modern person has become detached, almost wholly, from the group consciousness. This is our freedom and agency, it is part of our development, and growing up in consciousness towards the divine, but it also means that our prayers have a different origin. Our prayers may come from ourselves alone, and without connection with other consciousnesses. There is no obvious reason why a prayer from ourself will affect other selves, especially when those other selves are understood as, like ourselves, free agents. If our prayers caused effects in others, then the others would not be truly free, and vice versa. Or our prayers, especially group prayers, may derive from second-hand and external sources, from perceived stimuli interpreted by learned concepts. Such as prayers aimed at changing phenomena, knowledge of which has been derived from political propaganda, and the mass media, or from social media. This accounts for many prayers in church concerning official media accounts of wars, famines, diseases, as well as those prayers directed at enhancing the agendas of evil such as anti-racism, anthropogenic climate emergency, supposed or actual atrocities. In sum, modern people lack a plausible or real basis to explain, to themselves, as well as others, the effect of prayers. Mainstream people probably regard prayers as operating on the consciousness of the prayer, with a secondary group psychological effect, derived from the psychological experience of praying as a group. Modern traditionalists regard prayer, and indeed the church, rather as if it were an engineering project, a matter of assembling appropriate personnel, performing particular words in a particular ritual and symbolic context, leading to particular effects. Albeit and importantly by the grace of God, and not effectual from purely human and material causes. Yet despite the necessity of God, there is a very considerable quasi-objective positivism, materialism, reductionism, scientism, about the way that prayer, ritual, sacraments, even miracles, are understood by modern traditionalists, who have, innately and like it or not, the modern alienated consciousness. For trads, our business as mortal men is to regard Christian realities as objectively real categories with necessary cause and effect interactions, yet this is, in practice and intrinsically, to reduce humans to things, whatever protestations otherwise. What I am suggesting is that we ought not to think of prayer in a cause and effect fashion, operating between ourselves and other people or other things. We should instead regard prayer in the context of those entities with whom we ourselves are bound by relationships of love, as we and they were of a family. Where there is not this interpersonal, interbeing, love, then there will be no real prayer, but with love, all prayer will be significant, will make a difference. Where there is love, then prayer does not work by cause and effect, but works on the relationships. And by this, I means prayer works on the real and ultimate spiritual relationships, relationships that transcend and encompass physical relationships, and potentially extend to post-mortal life, and potentially eternally. In everyday life, our beneficial relationships are those which are loving, and which regard the other persona as a unique person, our relationship as unique. Actual benefits in relationships are seldom planned, and seldom contrived, but are consequent on living our loving relationships. We live in accordance with Christian love, and what actually happens always benefits from that, in some way, but not in a cause and effect way, and not leading to predictable outcomes, because we are relating to real people who are free agents. And that is how our prayers work also. The limits of created freedom. Francis Berger. If one follows the tenets of classical theism to their logical conclusions, it quickly becomes evident that God is the only authentically free being in the cosmos. On top of that, he will forever remain the only authentically free being in the cosmos. Immutable, impassible, and entirely self-sufficient, God does not need anything or any other being. Omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, and omnibenevolent, God is also not constrained or limited by anything or any other being. God is so free that his essence and existence are indistinguishable, making him utterly distinct from all other beings, all of which he created from nothing, none of which he needs. Put another way, God is perfectly free to be God, and there is nothing in the cosmos that does or can interfere with or influence his godly freedom, not even his creation, which he transcends. The only limits or constraints God experiences are the ones he sets for himself. More specifically, those that do not contradict his nature, his perfect wisdom and character. One notable limit God sets himself is the inability to create another God. Omnigod is also a mono-God. He does not want or need other gods. And even if he did, he couldn't create any. As free as God is, he is not free to create other gods. Try as he might, God could never raise any of his creatures to his level because it is logically impossible for him to do so. Moreover, God's free actual creatures could never utilize their freedom to become godlike or attain godhood. Thus, the freedom inherent in God's created actual beings cannot and never will contain any seed of godhood. Any created freedom that contained even a hint of godhood would not only contradict but also serve as a direct assault against God's freedom, which is the only uncreated freedom in existence. Of course, classical theism incorporates all of the above into its assumptions concerning God's overarching divine purposes for creation. I don't know about you, but those assumptions come off as awfully limiting, for both God and man. All I can say is this: God's overarching divine purposes become much freer and perhaps even more logical when one entertains the simple assumption that all freedom, not just God's, is uncreated. Note added, I used impassable when I mean impassable. HT to Bruce Charlton for catching that and bringing it to my attention. Heaven is more. William Wildblood. Many people have the idea, either consciously or as a kind of automatic assumption, that the spiritual world is somehow less substantial than the physical. After all, we get there by shedding the solid material body. In our minds, we rise. Ghosts can pass through walls. They presumably are not overbothered by density or gravity. They seem wispy, immaterial, bodiless. And if even ghosts have less substance than earthly men and women, how much more would that apply to those who have gone further and not lingered in an earthbound state? We say that Jesus ascended into heaven, which implies his body became light in both senses of the word. Does that mean he became less substantial? A moment's reflection shows that to be absurd. Less substantial means less real. When Jesus rose from the dead, he became more real because now his body operated at a higher level than the merely physical. Our material world is one of 3 dimensions, but the higher worlds contain more dimensions and are thus more real. They include more of reality and so are more, not less, substantial. A line has everything a point has but more. A plane contains more of reality than a line, and a cube more than a plane. And so on, though we currently lack the conceptual framework to understand that other than in a theoretical sense. But we can imagine that heaven has numerous dimensions, and this makes it real in a way that is inconceivable to us. Anyone of a mystical temperament knows that the world in which we currently live lacks full reality, certainly considerably less than we intuitively know exists. This is because our multi-dimensional soul has been squashed down to exist in a 3-dimensional state of being. This world is certainly real, but it is much less real than the higher worlds, which contain more and more of reality. From euthanasia to assisted suicide. not so much a slippery slope as jumping off a cliff. Bruce Charlton. I have been observing the suicidal turn of Western culture for considerably more than a decade. Its beginnings lie back many decades ago, while I was still a medical student. At that time, the issue was called euthanasia, and was focused upon people whose suffering was regarded as severe and intractable, and who were incapable of killing themselves, and their right to have somebody else kill them. More recently, there was a focus on dying with dignity, which meant without suffering, so that the debate expanded to include people who could kill themselves, but apparently only in ways that would cause them pain or suffering. The right being requested was for somebody else to kill such people painlessly, instead of them killing themselves painfully. Now, we call it assisted suicide, and have reached the point where there is no question of need, but instead the right demanded is to be killed pleasantly by somebody else. With the picture painted of a happy death by drowsing off into permanent sleep while outdoors in some beauty spot, such as a national park. When the question of creating a bureaucratic system for legally allowing some people deliberately to kill other people, there were warnings that this was morally a slippery slope. Well, if we examine the rationale behind such proposals, and the speed with which the right to be killed has expanded from a handful of people per nation to everybody, the issue has turned out to be more like jumping off a cliff from strict morality and unfortunate necessity, plummeting down into pure immoral, i.e. moral, convenience and consumer choice. The reason for allowing legalized murder has gone from being a last-ditch and desperate remedy for those terminally ill or agonizingly suffering, to a lifestyle preference. This is one of those many situations in which a top-down strategy meets mass acceptance, because in our godless materialistic society, the bottom line for values, for morals, for laws is simply utilitarian human psychology, that is, what people want, what makes people happy, what makes them feel less miserable. And this is a matter of inference, unsupportable assertion, and subjective opinion. A situation in which the apparatus of propaganda and ideology has the greatest scope, and where the prevalent sins of this age, fear, cowardice, demotivation, resentment, dishonesty and, most of all, despair, can operate freely and without trammel. Unless the trends reverse, and encouraged by deliberately engineered war, civil violence, disease and starvation, we will surely soon be seeing suicide become a publicly explicit and media-favored lifestyle strategy, with the Western bureaucracies providing whatever necessary facilities. In the spiritual war of this world, to have mass suicides of people for such reasons as loss of all hope, fear of the future, refusal to tolerate the possibility of pain, and despair at the present, is a big win for the powers of evil. Because these would be deaths happening in a state of self-chosen damnation, that is, dying while decisively rejecting the reality of God and the promises of Jesus Christ. There is, I believe, the maximum possible scope given us for post-mortal repentance, however we die. Death is not the end. Yet our decisions in mortal life make a permanent difference, and to leave this life in such a spiritual state as, apparently, those who express a desire to be killed pleasantly while contemplating a beautiful view. Well, this is very far from a fertile seedbed for repentance. Worming out of a deal with Satan. Bruce Charlton. An aphorism by Laeth that I linked a few days ago, talked of the possibility that some premortal spirits could make a deal with Satan, before incarnation. Thus, some beings, some humans, might be born with commitment to an evil agenda. This could be understood as someone born strategically evil. Such a person would also be prone to normal evil, which is selfish short-termism, which is, itself found with widely varying degrees, but perhaps never wholly absent. I mean, we are all prone to impulses of self-gratification. This combination of a deal to serve the general, global plans of Satan, with hope of some later and desired reward, is in conflict with doing what I want, now. I think this is seen in most people who have a leadership, strategic role in implementing Satan's agenda of evil. They try to worm out of doing their job towards fulfilling the long-term deal, and instead will grab what they want, now. This is one reason why it is a mistake to try and infer a strategy for evil. Even when there is an agenda, it will continually be contradicted and undermined by petty and personal corruption. From a Christian perspective, it is important not to misunderstand such conflict between personal and satanic evil, between evil strategies and immediate self-gratification. When the focus is on strategic evil, such as the global totalitarian plans, this is continually being sabotaged by the minions of Satan trying to worm out of their deals, including deals made pre-mortally. But this is not a turn towards good. The totalitarian order, clown world, may be, probably is, collapsing into infighting among selfish, self-gratifying subgroups and individuals. But welshing on a deal with Satan in order to seek immediate corruption, is not virtue. It might be asked why any spirit being would make such a deal. There might be a total incapacity for love, or a feebleness of loving impulse such that the being rejects the core divine principle of creation, e.a. God is love, and therefore joins Satan in opposition to God's creation, on the best terms he can negotiate, given that being's capabilities. The Second World War and its aftermath. William Wildblood. Seeing the path the world has taken over the last 80 years, I have occasionally wondered whether the demonic forces behind World War II were not so much aiming to win a conventional victory as hoping to use the reaction against the defeated Nazis to promote their agenda to bring down Western civilization and, more to the point since that was already on the turn, corrupt human souls. This is not to say the Nazis weren't the tools of darkness, but dare one suggest without being accused of contrarian revisionism, that they were not uniquely evil either. They, and especially Hitler, have been made into figures of archetypal wickedness, devils in human form, and it probably suits our self-image to cast them in that light because it makes us appear virtuous, but this is a problem because investing them with such unique evil gives the impression that everything they believed must have been wrong. Consequently, it becomes easy to define good as the opposite of that. This false idea then provides a fruitful area for exploitation in that morality becomes anything that is anti-Nazi. Let's see how this plays out. The Nazis believed in Aryan supremacy, so whatever works against that is good. Anti-racism, mass immigration, belittling one's own people and one's own country to the point that you accept or even welcome their disappearance if you are an Aryan, white, all this is good because it is the opposite of what the Nazis believed. If it's good, we go along with it even if it is against our own interests and our better judgment. The feeling we should do what is right for some and the glow of moral superiority for others overcome any lingering instincts of self-preservation. The Nazis were against sexual deviance, notwithstanding the personal behavior of some of them. Therefore, it becomes obvious that sexual liberation is a good thing. To oppose that is to be a cruel fascist, a control freak, a prude, a Nazi. To want to restrict love, you must be a hateful person. Love, or what is called love, is a justification for anything. By the way, a lot of misunderstandings could be avoided if we, like the ancient Greeks, had more than one word for the many different feelings covered by the simple word love. The Nazis wished to ban degenerate art, entartete Kunst, which we know simply as modern art. They saw this as un-German in inspiration and effect, criticizing it for its Freemasonic, Jewish or communist nature, Wikipedia. Their defeat left anyone with similar doubts about this kind of art, that it did not reflect the higher worlds as art traditionally was supposed to do but was more in tune with infernal regions, in a difficult position. If the Nazis thought modern art bad, then it must be good. If you too think it's bad, well then, you are a Nazi sympathizer. At the very least, you belong to an outmoded, out of touch and ignorant group. And so on. Now, in order to stop any latent Nazi tendencies to rise up once again, we must encourage all those things they were against. Evil then spreads not by force of arms but through propaganda, and even morality. And this, I would say, is because we have allowed ourselves to see the war against Hitler as an absolute good against absolute evil situation. As a result, for the last 80 years World War II has become a replacement foundation myth for Western civilization. And yet it was really just a war like many others. We need to put it behind us and no longer define ourselves in terms of our reaction to it, but it seems more important now than it ever was. When I was growing up in the 60s, it did not form a big part of my history lessons, but my children's history syllabus seemed to revolve almost entirely around it. They were taught a lot about Hitler and the Holocaust and practically nothing about Alfred the Great and the Armada. Maybe the reaction against the Nazi beliefs became Plan B for the dark forces, but, in terms of defeating the Christian West, that plan has been most effective. And speaking of Christianity, one should note that this was the one thing the Nazis were against that has not benefited from an anti-Nazi reactionary support. Coincidence? The defeat of Germany prompted the emigration of many European Marxists to America, where they spread their ideological poison, first in academia and then throughout the culture, in the process capturing all the institutions which now work against the nations they were set up to support. Whether this was part of the plan to begin with or whether it became the plan after military defeat is irrelevant at this point. The fact is the West allowed itself to be infected by a spiritual virus which has caused the sicknesses we suffer from today. Along with Russia, the West may have won the war on the battlefield, but in that victory there lay the seeds for its subsequent defeat. This piece is not written as part of the recent Churchill bashing trend. Churchill was clearly a complicated character. My friend Michael Lord knew him quite well in his later life and would sometimes be invited to lunch at his house at Chartwell. On one occasion he watched as Churchill fed his pet goose pain de foie gras from the dinner table, making the bird, in effect, a cannibal. A jolly joke. But, though one might wonder whether the state of Europe after the war was any better than it would have been without a war, with Britain ruined, and Eastern Europe communist, it must have seemed at the time as though there was no other option in the face of Nazi aggression, and Churchill was probably the right man to lead the country at that time. However, one may still be permitted to speculate as to whether the dark forces saw the war and its aftermath as a means to infect the West with atheistic communism, as it had to that point proved reasonably resistant to that spiritual disease, a disease to which we have now succumbed if you look at it, as you should, as something much more than an economic system. There are many people talking and writing about the, to all intents and purposes, communist takeover of the West and how we are being taught by this ideology to hate ourselves and all our past achievements. Our countries are being flooded with aliens and our cultures debased. Feminism is destroying the family, and masculinity, which, properly functioning, might arrest the decline, is derided. However, we can never understand what is happening until we see the assault as primarily spiritual, and the object of its attack being the soul and its relation to God. It is to sever this relationship that is the purpose of everything else. Jesus said, "Seek ye first the kingdom of heaven and all else will be added to you." He could just as well have said, "Abandon the search for the kingdom of heaven and you will lose everything else." We would do well to bear this in mind. It is no good resisting communism if you do not do so with the full remembrance of God, for what communism is chiefly all about is the replacement of God with man, but man in his fallen mode. This is how we can easily identify its satanic origin. The Heretofore holds the key to the hereafter. Francis Berger. I'm unsure how many people are familiar with or have read Michel Tournier's The Ogre. Originally published in 1970, the novel resurfaced as a blip on the public radar in 1996 when it was made into a film starring John Malkovich. The early parts of the novel, the sinister writings of Abel Tifages, written in the first person from the protagonist's point of view, are mystical in tone and somewhat engaging. After that, for reasons I'll never understand, Tournier alters the narrative voice to the third person, then oscillates between the third-person omniscient narrator and Abel's first-person narration. The jarring back and forth between voices shreds the coherence and continuity of the plot, and about two-thirds of the way through the book, Tournier seems to struggle with his creation. The fictional landscape he creates overwhelms him, and the reader can almost sense him struggling to find a coherent way out. One lay reviewer referred to the novel as one of those books you can't put down even though you know that the writer is doing little more than taking a giant shit in your brain. It certainly has that feeling at times. Anyway, I happened to pluck the novel from my shelves the other day and was struck by the brief but vivid exposition on premortal existence in the book's second paragraph. And I do believe I issued from the mists of time. I've always been shocked at the frivolous way people agonize about what's going to happen to them after they die and don't give a damn about what happened to them before they were born. The heretofore is just as important as the hereafter, especially as it probably holds the key to it. As for me, I was already there 100,000 years ago. When the earth was still only a ball of fire spinning around in a helium sky, the soul that lit it and made it spin was mine. What's more, the dizzying antiquity of my origins explains my supernatural power, being and I have traveled side by side for so long. We're such old companions that while we may not be especially fond of one another, by dint of being together almost since the world began, we understand one another and can't refuse each other anything. For me, the part about the heretofore is just as important as the hereafter, especially as it probably holds the key to it, is a keen insight and represents one of the chief shortcomings of conventional Christian thought. The seriousness, joy, and beauty of mortal life diminish if it is bookended only by the hereafter. How much richer and more meaningful mortal life becomes if it is also bookended by the heretofore, especially when one includes the idea that the key to the hereafter resides in the heretofore. The why of why we are here and why we should choose resurrection lays nestled in the decisions we made before our incarnation. Note: this post was sparked by an aphorism by Laeth and Dr. Charlton's expansion of the idea.